Hello, beloved, and welcome to Theology Thursday with me, Pastor Will, where we've been talking a bit about what it is that Lutherans believe, using Luther's Small Catechism for our guide. We've been talking about the Ten Commandments, and this week we are coming to the end. For the past several weeks, we've talked about how the commandments guide right conduct, both in how we relate to God and how we relate to our neighbors. We've seen that each commandment directs not only what harmful actions we ought to avoid, but also what helpful actions we ought to actively engage in. Now, today, we are looking at the last two commandments. Both the 9th and 10th commandments deal with the sin of coveting. We'll spend a bit of time talking about how these commandments relate to each other and to the rest of the commandments. So let's take a look. What is the 9th commandment? You shall not covet your neighbor's house. What does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not try to trick our neighbors out of their inheritance or property, or try to get it for ourselves by claiming to have a legal right to it and the like, but instead be of help and service to them in keeping what is theirs. And what is the 10th commandment? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And what does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not entice, force, or steal away from our neighbors their spouses, household workers, or livestock, but instead urge them to stay and fulfill their responsibility to our neighbors. Now, if it seems strange to you that we count two separate commandments regarding the sin of coveting, well, you're not alone. As we discussed several weeks ago at the start of the Ten Commandments, there are other ways of numbering the commandments that lump both of these together as the 10th, and then perhaps separate out a prohibition against graven images from the prohibition to have any other gods. In his large catechism, Luther even chooses to lump these two together and speak to both commandments at once. So why bother having two? It seems to me that the distinction here is between coveting things that my neighbor owns and coveting beings that my neighbor is in relationship with. Now, in the context in which these commandments were first recorded, it is true that livestock, slaves, and even one's wife were considered the property of the master of the household. But while we quite rightly no longer consider people as property, there is still value to exploring this commandment so that we can consider not only how we approach the things our neighbor owns, but also the relationships our neighbor is a part of. The other thing we ought recognize here is that coveting is a bit different than the other prohibitions we've discussed. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th commandments all forbid harmful actions against our neighbor. And we discussed how there are implications for our attitudes as well. It isn't enough to avoid killing our neighbor. We are also forbidden to hate them. It isn't enough to avoid committing adultery, as we are to refrain from dehumanizing others as though they were merely objects of pleasure. And we might even think that the 7th commandment, you shall not steal, would cover these two about coveting. We've already said that if it isn't yours, you shouldn't take it. And so perhaps the difference is that whereas the other commandments carry an implicit warning to guard our attitudes, these two carry an explicit one. To covet is to desire something. Now, from time to time, I've heard it used in the context of saying, perhaps during hard times, I covet your prayers. In that sense, there is a proper desire for somebody to hold us in prayer. But coveting in general is a deeper desire, a lusting after, and it tends to come with intent. We might see a friend wearing a new jacket and think, gosh, that's nice, I'd really like one. And there's nothing wrong with such a thought. The problem is when we see our friend's new jacket and we start to think, well, they don't deserve something quite so nice, and it would look better on me anyhow, and it's not fair for them to have it when I don't. For Tolkien fans, the character of Gollum in The Lord of the Rings is a prime example of a soul twisted by coveting after the One Ring, and indeed the effect that that ring has on any who come near it is to inspire covetous thoughts that corrupt their actions. And maybe that is the reason we have 2 commandments to deal with the sin of coveting, because coveting is a sin of the heart that spreads and corrupts. If I allow myself to covet what my neighbor has, it's a pretty short leap to trying to take it for myself. If I allow myself to covet my neighbor's partner, then I might already be making excuses in my mind for why adultery really wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. So what are we not to do? In regards to matters of property, Luther seems primarily concerned that we don't try to trick our neighbor out of what is rightfully theirs through legal means. Likewise, as regards the persons in our neighbor's life, Luther sees here a prohibition against enticing others away from our neighbor. In the Large Catechism, Luther approaches both the 9th and 10th commandments as prohibitions against taking from our neighbors, even in ways that would preserve our own honor. That is to say, we might know that theft is against the law and a dishonorable act. But here Luther might say that if I'm playing cards with my neighbor and absolutely taking them to the cleaners, inspiring them to bet wildly and taking all that they have, well, what I'm doing isn't illegal, but it is wrong. Or bringing some kind of frivolous lawsuit against someone in an effort just to improve my fortunes by forcing him to give me what I don't have any right to. I may have gone about this in a legal way, but it doesn't make it moral. Likewise, we've already discussed the prohibition against adultery, but here Luther would argue that if I'm showering attention and affection on my neighbor's wife and trying to convince her to leave him for me, I'm wronging my neighbor, even if we never once engage in extramarital sex. Or if I have a business and I know that my competitor has a really sharp employee, and I go out and start to try to lure them into leaving their employer just to work for me, I'm wronging my neighbor. In each case, my behavior might be legal, but it is not moral. The guiding principle here is just because I can do something doesn't mean that I should. When I start to want something so bad that I don't care who it hurts for me to get it, well, then I'm no longer in control of my desires. And the flip side of this commandment is that as much as it is within my power to do so, I am to help my neighbor keep what is theirs. And again, we have talked before about how the other commandments carry an exhortation to help our neighbor. The 7th commandment, you shall not steal, also includes an exhortation to build up and maintain what belongs to our neighbor. And so perhaps here, just as we are meant to guard against covetous attitudes of our own hearts, perhaps the exhortation is to help our neighbor guard against covetous thoughts in theirs. If my friend is in a relationship, not only am I to refrain from trying to entice his partner away, perhaps I am also meant to encourage him to be faithful. If my friend has what they need for their daily life, perhaps I am not only meant to refrain from trying to cheat him out of it, but I am also meant to encourage him to recognize the abundance he has and find satisfaction in having enough. Well, friends, this brings us to the end of the 10 Commandments. Next week, we'll take a look at the conclusion to the 10 Commandments, and from there we'll be moving on to the Apostles' Creed. I hope to see you next time. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you, beloved.